Coming up on River City Presents, we'll be discussing underrated presidents with Professor of History at WKCTC, Brent Taylor. Welcome to River City Presents. My name's Daniel Hurt. Are presidents underrated and overrated? Today we will be looking at legacies of all of our 45 presidents of the United States with Professor of History here at WKCTC, Brent Taylor. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to see you again.
Yes, absolutely. This is like your third or fourth time on the program.
Yeah,
now,
we're
right?
losing count because it's been several times.
Just like you so well, we want to keep having you back. But we had thought about doing this project where essentially we took our top 5 overrated and underrated presidents. Some of them deserve to be where they are, placed in history, but some of them history has not judged maybe as well as they should, or maybe thinks too much of them. So why don't we get started and start with the underrated list? So why don't you go ahead with your first underrated president?
All right, then. We got to have this thing.
From Funk and Wagnall Sports since noon today.
This is the official list. So my 5th, top 5, underrated, overrated. Number 5 on underrated, I have James Monroe.
Okay. I know, I get it. I get it. Because, you know, he's sort of, they called him the good era, positive era president or something like that, right?
Era of good feelings.
That's it.
Yeah, so that's actually a pretty rare thing. If you look back and you say, well, how many eras are eras of good feelings in general, so lowercase, versus this one era of good feelings capitalized, it's pretty rarefied air. It's a good economy. Politically, everybody's getting along. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a rare thing.
It was right after the War of 1812?
Yeah, so that's where all the patriotic fervor is running high. We're feeling good about it. More importantly, the differences between the parties had almost disappeared. In fact, we went through a little brief period where we kind of thought that the two-party system was an anomaly and it was going to go away.
Wow, really? I did not know that.
Yeah, there was just a brief period. If you look back at some of the older elections, you'll see where they had actually gotten rid of the party system and you have no party designations.
That's amazing to think about that today.
I know, yeah, just to even imagine it is pretty wild. Then in the realm of foreign policy, we've got the Monroe Doctrine, very important for staking our claim to this hemisphere and telling Europe to stay out of it. Now, part of that secretly is the British are on board with it because it helped them sort of maintain their hegemony. But it still was kind of a big statement.
And that's the Monroe Doctrine, right? That's
Monroe Doctrine, this area is closed to all of your colonization.
It's pretty great because it's kind of like, that's our playground, not yours.
Yeah, and that's kind of a stretching the wings moment for a pretty young country.
And of all the, would you think he's like the last of the founding presidents too, or does he count?
He does sort of count. In dress, he definitely plays the part. He's the last guy in public to wear the breeches, the little short pants.
Yeah. After that, it was sans culotte, I believe, right?
Oh, yeah, the French Revolution effect, for sure. But that's big legacy, the Monroe Doctrine all by itself. Plus, you look at era of good feelings. Plus, you look at acquisition of Florida.
Yes, that's right.
That's a big deal. So all these, nobody ever talks about Monroe, but I think that lands him on my underrated spot.
So my underrated number 1 is Woodrow Wilson, and I'm sure that probably doesn't surprise you. But I think that if you think about Wilson, let's start with foreign policy. So his foreign policy, the League of Nations, although it failed, it really sets the stage for the United Nations. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Oh yeah, League of Nations is the forerunner of all that stuff, for sure. And he broke some precedents. He was the first president to actually leave American territory.
Yes.
To go to Paris to negotiate all that stuff.
He thought he was a savior. He went to Britain and they were like, oh, the American president's here. And then he gave them a cold welcome too. And they were like, oh, wait a minute. I thought you were our friend.
There's kind of a funny story about that.
Go ahead.
When he's looking at the 14 points. And so now we're going to introduce that to Lloyd George and Clemenceau. And they turn around and look at each other, and one of them says to the other, 14 points. God himself only had 10.
And he did, that is one of the things about Wilson is he very much had he had a messianic complex. He really thought God wanted him to be president and he was going to carry out God's will across the world. And, so with the foreign policy, you got World War I, and I think he pretty well, whether it's true or not, claims credit for bringing order to the end of World War I and, setting the stage for the United Nations, what would ultimately become. But if you look at his domestic agenda, you're talking about workers' rights, you're talking about the work week being established, child labor laws, a lot of things that sort of were exploitive about big business. He sort of brought what he did in New Jersey in just 2 or 3 years, he brings to the White House. And, I feel like that his domestic policy is very progressive. I think it is very supportive of workers' rights. I think that his foreign policy is a legacy that we still use today. Even Article 5, which we, going on with the Ukraine conflict, we had missiles hit Poland accidentally, and they talked about bringing out this attack against one as an attack against us all. And sort of all of that in itself comes from the League of Nations because that's what led to its failure, right?
Collective security. That was the buzzword in that part of the century. And that's the perfect definition. Attack against one is an attack against all.
Yeah, absolutely. So who you got on your list next?
My number 4 underrated president was Andrew Jackson.
Underrated Andrew Jackson. I like
Underrated,
this. What do you
yeah.
got?
So, you some people will argue that he's overrated. He's on the $20 bill. What did he do? I think the number one thing that goes against him is the Indian Removal Act. So, obviously, a good reason there. But let's say that we do a blind resume. You take that item off the resume, and you're just looking at President X.
Yeah.
We don't know about all of his contentiousness and his battles with all of his enemies and all of these things. We just see the legacy. In his case, number one thing is you've got zero national debt. So not a budget surplus for 2 years, but zero national debt, first and only.
I don't know how that happens.
It happened through tariff policy, a lot of it. And then also the federal government was very frugal. So federal government, 19th century, was not there to pay your doctor bills or any of that stuff. It was basically there in case you get invaded. You have a judicial system. That's about it.
Sort of bare bones function. And if you have a bare bones function, then you don't need a lot of money for what's going on.
Right. And so then we had a good economy. The tariffs were bringing in all that revenue. And funny thing about that era, the government felt embarrassed by the surpluses. That they shouldn't have all this extra money sitting here. Yeah. Embarrassment of riches.
Oh, we're doing so well. How could we?
Yeah. But then on top of that, you throw in the nullification crisis.
Yes, I was about to bring that up.
Good, because that's very important. You've got a state saying, we don't have to listen to that federal law.
John C. Calhoun being a jerk, yeah.
And you have Jackson saying, well, yeah, you do. It's called the Supremacy Clause.
And that's sort of, I guess, the first time that, in a long time, that really the Union was challenged. And Jackson, to his credit, went down there and said, you will comply.
Yeah, and as soon as it became clear that he was going to put the band together and maybe militarily act with all this stuff, suddenly the nullification people were like, well, did we say nullification? We meant just slight disagreement.
Yeah, wasn't that, I guess the last time that happened would have been Washington, right? With the Whiskey Rebellion or something.
That really would have been, I guess, the last serious thing before that.
But nullification, that's a really good point. I mean, I think that if anything that goes to his legacy, I think his willingness to preserve the Union, sort of proto-preserve the Union.
Union, capital U.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And they meant it.
And, with Wilson, as I was thinking, the fact that you talked about the negatives of their record, and I failed to mention that, like the fact that he's showing Birth of a Nation at the White House and, is an unapologetic racist. I mean, those are obviously negatives that go against him, but I suppose you could make the argument that the times that you live in, because, he was raised, South Carolina, right at the end of the Civil War was when he grew up, or was born?
I believe Virginia, but son of a preacher.
Virginia, yeah, that's right.
I think he had some early memories of seeing some Civil War soldiers, things like that. I remember reading something like that somewhere.
But it's that connection to the Old South that I think that is in addition to that. Well, on mine, the second one I have on underrated, I have Jimmy Carter on there. And I know a lot of people, I think it's fair to say that a lot of people have said already in national media that he's someone whose presidency has sort of gotten a second look.
Right.
And I think that one of my favorite things that he ever did was the malaise speech, as they called it.
Right.
Because we were in the middle of an energy crisis, gas prices are high, sounds kind of familiar.
Yes.
You know, the OPEC cartel's playing games. And he comes on TV and says, well, it's not just a problem of the economy, it's also a problem of spirit. It's an emotional problem as well. And I think he taps into a lot of things that are relevant still. The consumerist nation that we are, the fact that we want instant gratification, the fact that we don't come together as a country anymore as often as we should. I think those are all fair criticisms. And you know, at the time, it's kind of like the president you don't want to hear the president say, you're bad, you're doing all these things wrong if you're the American public, because, you know, no one likes to be criticized, I suppose. But in retrospect, he was right about a lot of things in that speech, I think.
There's also a little hopeful tone in there where he says that, you know, the best days are not necessarily behind us.
They don't have
that
to
kind
be.
of tone.
Yeah.
Right. So I can definitely see where you would come from on that one, especially with that speech.
And then his energy policy, I mean, solar panels on the roof, you saw Obama do that. I think Trump kept them maybe, and then Biden did it, or is going to do it probably. So it's one of those things where, you know, he was an early proponent of alternative energy sources, and of course he'd have to be in the 70s with the energy crisis going on too.
Yeah.
And you know, I think that the things that go in his foreign policy too, with the Camp David Accords, you know, he's bringing
that's big.
Peace in the Middle East. I mean,
and the main thing about that is it's very enduring. So Egypt and Israel didn't get along at all, and really since then it's not been the worst relationship, especially in that region.
And you had at one point, I guess it was in the 50s and 60s, when Gamal Abdel Nasser was president of Russia or president of Egypt. They had the Russians, the Soviets, come in and were investing all kinds of money financially in there, and Kissinger's getting on the plane and coming down and trying to, you know, contain the Soviets in North Africa. And, you know, Anwar Sadat comes along after Nasser dies of a heart attack and says, hey, let's actually do this peace deal. And everyone's kind of skeptical, but Jimmy Carter is like getting Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat in the same room together.
That's
it's
a good get.
Accomplishment.
That's a good get. There's no taking that away from him at all.
And there's this famous moment where it looks like the deal's going to break, and it's not going to happen. And Carter gets pictures of Begin's grandchildren and signs it, you know, thanks for coming. And it's like, what could have been? And in that moment, Begin got emotional and said, okay, let's make the deal. And so they go walk into this room thinking about all the future and what's at stake, and they sign a peace treaty between Arabs and Israelis, and, you know, at the first time ever, potentially. And Sadat said, you know, in so doing, I'm going to catch a lot of heat and probably get killed. And he did. In 81 or 2, he did get assassinated. And so, you know, it's one of those,
all right,
everybody put everything on the table. And he's got that in his legacy enshrined forever. Why do you think, though, I think one of the negatives that everybody said about Carter was that he was weak. Do you think it was just the failed rescue attempt at Iran that caused that to stain his legacy?
That's a big part of it, because you're looking at 444 days, and especially in an age of mass media, and they're keeping account of it.
It's just on TV every day.
Day 232, day 296,
and you've got
day
a guy
312
who's not president yet saying, well, what I'd do if I was in the White House, and it's like he gets to say that every day, you know.
Gets to hammer it.
So
that was really the last thing Carter needed.
And then, of course, you know, and the big sort of slap at his face ultimately, and I think the thing that really harmed his reputation was the fact that on Inauguration Day for Ronald Reagan in 1981, those guys are on a plane on their way back to the U.S. I mean,
oh yeah, you know? That's really sort of like the big finale to all that.
And Reagan sort of gets the claim credit for that, even though he wasn't really in office during any of the negotiations. So, I mean, it's just interesting to see that, you know, the things that you do as president, you might not get credit for, but you don't do it for that reason, right? You do it because you're you're trying to do the best job you can.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of like the economy, right? Everybody always claims the last 2 years of the previous guy's economy.
Yeah. So, look at this. Historically low unemployment. Look at me go. It's like, man, you've been in office 7 months.
Exactly.
It's my economic policy. It took effect like that.
Yeah, instantaneous.
So what's your number 3? What do you got?
Number 3, LBJ.
I like this. Okay.
Underrated.
All right.
This is another guy where we're going to do the blind resume test. So what we will remove is Vietnam.
Oh, yeah.
You take anything related to Vietnam off the table,
Yeah. One of
Take
the
the-
greatest presidents ever.
take the name off, blind resume, you're looking at the Great Society, the war on poverty. That is a very, very, very long list of accomplishments. Just the number of serious big laws
Yeah.
in that entire stretch is really amazing.
Yeah, and I actually almost put him on my list, but I have something, say, for overrated that we will do, whether it's on another episode or however we do it. But I think that if you think about that, civil rights, poverty programs, Medicare, the early, WIC, women childhood care, food stamps. He's hosting Dr. King at the White House. He's got a civil rights icon as a vice president, Hubert Humphrey. It's an outstanding list of accomplishments. And, one of the tragedies, I suppose, is that the war in Vietnam is sort of where all the money got dragged into Vietnam, and they weren't able to spend it on the social programs, and then the social programs sort of didn't do necessarily what they were supposed to do. So that's sort of where you're going with that.
The classic guns or butter argument.
Oh, it's so bad because he really wanted to be like the iconic president. He ends up, dropping out of a re-election campaign.
Yeah, total surprise. Just kind of came out of nowhere. I mean, you would maybe even expect it, if you could relive that, to just see him battle it out.
Yeah.
Because he had dominated the Senate for all those years, and then he had descended to the presidency. He had the bully pulpit.
And
You
boy,
might-
did he know how to use that. He'd be like, I need to talk to you. You're going to do what I tell you to do. You got that?
Right. Yeah, it was kind of interesting. I guess the polls, he must have seen some polls that were just
Man.
unbelievable.
It's just if you're running against the Kennedy, it's a hard game. I think he really was worried about, what the consequences would be of a primary like that. But primaries were decided differently then, too. It wasn't really the straight election. It was still a convention fight, too. So, I don't know. I just find that to be a really great choice. I almost had it on my list. My number 3 is George H.W. Bush. I think that's one that I think history should judge him very well, because if you look at his 4 years, he's just president for 4 years.
Right.
And, Reagan says, let's tear down the wall. It wasn't actually Reagan that was president when the wall comes down. It was Bush. And Bush manages the end of the Cold War, the reunification of Germany, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Gulf War, where you had Russia and the U.S. on the same side of a conflict. You had, the most cooperative international system against Saddam Hussein in the early 90s that you've ever seen, even to this day. So you're talking about a foreign policy expert, possibly the best foreign policy team we've ever had. You had Quayle, you had James Baker, Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice was a national security advisor. Don't you think that just on foreign policy alone, he's way, way underrated?
He had a resume built for foreign policy. There's no question about that. CIA director, vice president, then president. There was really almost, if you had Secretary of State in there, you would have had the complete package maybe,
Yeah.
like they had envisioned back in the day. Way early in the American experience, Secretary of State was seen as the path.
And the youngest fighter pilot?
All right, World War II hero, just as kind of a bio backstory.
And then on his domestic policy, if you think about this, he raised taxes, he went against the campaign promise, and I think that's actually a good play, because he did what he thought was right regardless of a campaign promise, even though it ended up hurting him politically. And if you look, the Clinton economy is pretty good. Remember, it's that Clinton economy, look how great we did, But
Yeah.
some of that starts in the Bush era, I think. So
Yeah, he certainly went down with the ship on that campaign promise.
he sure did.
And then maybe one more thing to add to
yeah.
the underrated would be the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Oh, I didn't know.
That's a huge legacy.
I didn't know that.
Affects
So
anything you
all
do.
the entrances and exits of buildings and all
All
that. It's
the
hard to-
entrances, if you take an online class, it affects how that operates. There's a lot to it.
It's interesting how like that piece of legislation could change the way everything looks.
Yeah, it's monumental in that way.
So who you got for your number 4?
All right, so my number 2 underrated president is James Polk.
That's exactly what mine is. That's
really?
amazing.
That is interesting. We had him in the same spot. Yeah. So I guess we'll have a really easy conversation on this
Yeah.
one. So just to start off, promising that we only need one term, not even intending to serve a second term.
Yeah.
There's something sort of bold and brash about that.
The other parties couldn't get their stuff together, right? He's like, you send me up there, I'm going to fix some stuff. I'll show you how it's done.
Yeah, so he's an Andrew Jackson protege. He's young Hickory. Andrew Jackson's old Hickory. And so he's kind of got that for his origin story. And then in office, Oregon, that's huge. People wanted a war over Oregon. We don't have to have a war. We'll just negotiate half and half. They'll see the threat of the war. They won't want that. We don't really want it. So let's split Oregon right down the middle.
He's sort of a foreign policy master early on then. He
In
knows
that
the
case, for
diplomatic
sure.
game. Yeah.
Yeah, because see, the whole thing was 54-40 or fight. Well, what about if you bump that down into the 40s and don't fight?
Yeah. And you get a lot of what you want.
Got a whole lot of what they wanted without the war. And then on the war side, there is the Mexican War.
Yeah.
And
Where a lot of Civil War generals get their knowledge too.
oh, just that legacy alone, that's not really his doing, but that's big.
Yeah.
They all got to know each other, how they all operated, and all the rest of it. But then the territorial acquisition, the size of that is
it's
larger
the
than many countries.
Yeah, it's insane.
You're talking West Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of several other states. Everything in that region except for later the Gadsden Purchase.
Really.
All part of the Mexican
Well,
cession.
and if you think about it, you're talking about a guy who just said, all right, 4 years, and he actually said some of this stuff is a campaign promise too, right? It was sort of like, 4 years, I'm going to do this, this, and this.
Yeah, I think the intention was always just, we're going to do it pedal to the metal, no second term
And
required.
he did all of the things he said he was going to do nearly, right?
Oh, yeah, I looked at a list of that. and I don't remember all the details, but I think he had like 5 main points. And it was either 4 or 5 accomplished.
That's amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, hard to do.
And especially in today's time, that kind of challenge, who's going to run on 8 points and they get all of them done now, especially with Congress and all that. And he had to deal with that too, but the circumstances were different.
Yeah, in the 1840s, I think you could get away with it a little bit. We weren't quite as contentious as we were in the 1850s, so maybe he just had a little bit of luck playing into that, where he didn't have all the headwinds that some people have.
Yeah. Well, what do you got for your last one?
Then my number 1 underrated president, William McKinley.
Okay, let's go.
So that one's a little different,
I have
right?
no idea why you picked that.
Man, that's off the wall. That's crazy talk. So McKinley was the most popular president in his time since Lincoln, basically. And we see a little bit of a bridging of that gap between the North and the South. It's been 50 years or so since we had the big fight, and so we're kind of putting that aside. And part of why that's his legacy is the Spanish-American War. So Spanish-American War is often viewed as a way that North and South were putting their differences aside, coming together once again as a union.
He gave him
and moving forward.
It's kind of like having a war to put everybody together. It's the rally around the flag effort, more or less.
Yeah, it happened, and so then there's a little bit of credit due there. That war also was managed pretty well. The Philippine theater of that war, very, very successful.
It was a splendid little war.
Splendid little war, right? Yeah, It was kind of like the last of the adventure wars before things got serious.
Hey guys, we're going to go down there and take over some stuff. It's going to be great. You know?
Yeah, and then of course you're making war heroes with Theodore Roosevelt and all that. But even the Cuba thing, the legacy on all this, owning the Philippines,
Yeah.
although temporarily. Guam, we still own it. Puerto Rico, still own it. The rights to build Guantanamo Bay,
Still there.
still there, still part of the legacy. That's very big.
Yeah.
Very big. Then also some economic stuff too, which is some people view McKinley as the first modern president. So that would sort of precede the progressive era presidents, which get all that
Yeah,
credit.
because everybody thinks of Roosevelt and Wilson as being modern presidents.
Right, but some people say that it's McKinley, and you would kind of do that, and moving away from tariffs a little bit, those kinds of things, which are all more modern.
Yeah. That's fascinating. And the last one that I have, I picked Richard Nixon, and that may surprise people, but in what do you think?
It's a bold choice.
Yeah.
It's a bold choice.
Well, resignation and humiliation is probably not what you think of.
So is this another one where we do the blind resume and you remove Watergate?
Yes, if you take Watergate away, and here's the thing this is what I like about Nixon. When Nixon got in office, he's not really, people think of Republicans as conservative. He's not really a conservative president. If you think about, he put Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who would go on to become a very liberal senator from New York, in charge of his domestic policy. You have the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, you have a bunch of liberal environmental policies. He ends the draft, which is not a Democratic Party idea. That's a Republican Party idea, because Bobby Kennedy and Johnson and Humphrey all stood strong for the draft. You have, a surprising number of civil rights policies. You have a surprising number of pretty liberal economic policies. He put Donald Rumsfeld in charge of a housing program. We're going to find low-income housing for people. And so it's just a fascinating setup for that. What do you think that all that's fair if you take the resume off, that it's going to
So when you take Watergate out, it gets a lot more interesting, right? Because you get the blind resume. I think, did you mention Environmental Protection Agency?
I did.
Yeah. So that alone is a massive, massive legacy. There are lots of things that cannot even be considered without going through that office.
Yeah.
And that is a big deal.
And I think that the only things, the Vietnam War, there's the bombing in other countries that he shouldn't have done that was illegal, and it was the really things he didn't have to do, like that. Spying on George McGovern, which, come on, he was going to beat George McGovern. McGovern carried like one state. Like, what was he worried about? But, he's sort of a paranoid personality, though. He did
That's
not
always been the knock on him was that. And so he had some political enemies in his past, and of course they named him Tricky Dick.
Yeah.
And so he was a counterpuncher and all that stuff. And I guess that was kind of the next extension of that.
But if you look at his legacy, it's sort of ending the draft, this peace with honor, having an exit strategy with Vietnam. He saw that it was a boondoggle and wanted to get out of there. His domestic policy agenda is pretty progressive and forward thinking. You had a pretty solid economy during that time too. I don't recall a lot of Americans complaining about the way things were. The reason for his exit was more about his own discretionary problems, right?
The economy thing is a little dicier because you're beginning to see that wave of inflation. Now, some of that's beyond his control. We had the oil shocks, and then the subsequent price increase of everything because everything arrives on a truck.
Yeah.
So there was some stuff there that was kind of spinning out of control for him. But it is interesting when you take the broader list of things and just put them on a piece of paper.
That's exactly right.
That's true.
Well, we're out of time. We're going to have to do another episode on the overrated presidents, which should prove interesting. But I want to thank you for coming on, and we'll be doing that one next time.
Thank you.
All right. That was our show. We just discussed the underrated presidents, and we're going to come back with another episode on overrated presidents. We'll hope you join us.